Chapter 9, Grouping, Differentiation, and Technology. Our organizing questions for this chapter are, what are the elements of effective instruction beyond just a good lesson? How are students grouped to accommodate achievement differences? So we're going to look at different types of grouping. What are some ways of differentiating and personalizing instruction? Differentiation is a big push right now. What educational programs exist for students placed at risk? And how is technology used in education? We're going to look at this case study that's in your book. Mr. Arbuthnot presents a lesson on long division to his fourth grade students. He feels his lesson is interesting and well organized. When he asks his students several questions, several students raise their hands and always know the answers. Yet, at the end of the period, he is shocked and disappointed when he gives a quiz and finds out that only a third of his class got the problems correct. How is he effective in meeting his students' individual needs? How might he be more effective in meeting his students' individual needs? So, if your students aren't able to do the quiz at the end of the class, and only a few students are actually getting them right, you would suggest that he's not effective. I've actually sat in, I can't tell you how many happy hours or parties or whatever, and I've listened to teachers talk. My husband was a teacher as well. And they'd say, oh, my kids aren't motivated. And, my entire fifth period class failed the geometry test. Well, if your entire class is failing, they're not failing, you're failing. If none of the kids in your class are motivated, guess what? You're not motivated, or you're not motivating them. So sometimes we have to take ownership of what our students learn and what they don't learn. So when we look at a lesson, you can give a good lesson, but it might not be effective. So as a teacher, you must be concerned with many elements of instruction, not just the presentation of the information. You got to know how to adapt your instruction based on the kid's level of knowledge. That's why I said that deer in the headlight look, that you have to be able to read your students' faces to be able to know whether or not they're getting the material. And sometimes you have to make corrections in midstream while you're teaching. You also have to motivate students to learn. The next chapter, chapter 10, is completely on motivation and what does it take to motivate kids. You also have to manage student behavior, because one of the biggest reasons why teachers leave and why they're fired is because of student behavior. And if kids are misbehaving, either they're not engaged, or it's too hard for them, or it's too easy for them. So you have to look at that. When kids are actively involved in a lesson and when they're interested in a lesson, there isn't time for misbehavior. We also have to look at how we group students for instruction. And sometimes you think, so many teachers will say, I want to teach all the gifted kids because it's so easy. It's not easy to teach gifted kids. And we also have to look at assessing students. If you've probably sat through a lesson where you already knew all the answers or what the teacher was thinking and you were like, I'm so bored. And then there's other times when we look at something and it's way too hard because you don't have the prerequisite knowledge. So assessment plays a key role in what is going beyond that good lesson. Carol was one of the first ones to study what does it take, what's the overall picture of it. And one of the things that Carol's model talks about is time spent on learning. We have available clock time. Now, in some other countries, kids go to school way longer than we do. It's interesting. Finland is always brought up as this model school, and it is. But the kids actually have an hour and a half of instruction, and then they have about a 30-minute recess break for every hour and a half of instruction. But they go much longer. They go till about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So you can look at minutes of actual instructional time and then minutes of recreational time, and minutes of instructional time equal to be about the same as we have, because they go longer in the day. But the kids take these breaks, and it also gives time for the teachers to get things ready so they can have deeper and richer types of activities that they go on. And that leads us to that quality of instruction. If you're just moving from point to point, and you can't be on your top game on every single lesson that you teach, it's really hard if you don't plan well enough or you don't have time to plan. And then student perseverance, the focus and attention. And what we're doing right now is we are expecting kids to be on their game and attending and focusing from if you're an elementary kid, you start at 8:05 till 2:05, and you may have a break for lunch. A lot of schools has even cut out recess and stuff like that. So they really don't have any downtime, and that's hard. You probably could not sit through 6 hours of instruction anymore. You're used to 20 minutes, a half hour, especially with TV shows being, attention span being about 15 minutes long, or on a web about 5 minutes long. So the time that you need to learn depends on your attitude, or your aptitude, students' aptitude, how long that they can stay focused. Students' prior knowledge, what do they come with, what do they bring to the table, and then also the student's ability to learn. And in one classroom, you could have a kid with just a low average IQ all the way up to a high gifted IQ. So their ability or their aptitude to learn also affects. So you have a teacher that's trying to meet the needs of a child who's on the slower pace, and then one that's going to get it really soon or really quickly. So when we look at Slavin's Ch9 model, he breaks it up into quality of instruction, appropriate levels of instruction, incentive, and time. And he talks about quality of instruction. A lesson should make sense to that student. And we also know that the teachers have to have that information. They have to have enough background knowledge themselves to be able to teach the lesson. If you've ever been in a class where a teacher really didn't know what they were talking about, you know that you've lost instructional time there. Appropriate levels of instruction means that it shouldn't be too hard for the kids. You want them to be able to reach it. Like, you're going to scaffold that so that they can reach up there and pull themselves up that ladder because you're there helping them. But you don't want it to be so easy that they can just walk over that ladder and just step right over it. So it shouldn't be too difficult, or it shouldn't be too easy. And don't ever say to a kid, oh, don't worry, you can get this. It's so easy. Why do it if it's so easy? That means it's busy work. You can say to them, you know what, this is really tough, and we're going to work on it together, and you're going to get it. I told you, in Ron Clark's Academy, and he has really high success rates with these kids, he says things like, you're going to cry. Every fifth grader will cry, because if it's not worth doing, it's not worth, if it's worth doing, it's worth crying over, because you got to struggle. And he'll say, it's difficult, but we have all the support here for you to make it. And so then when you do make it, when you do conquer something that's really, really difficult, then you feel so good about yourself. And that's that incentive where students should be motivated to learn the material, that you're pushing them, that you're kind of dangling that apple, and you're telling them that it's hard, but you're going to make it, and here's the rewards that are going to happen when you do make it. And then we also talk about time, that kids should have enough time to learn the material. And that means allocated time, the time that the teacher allocates to actually teaching it, so that the kids have time to absorb it and process it and do it. But then also engaged time, how much time the students are actually spending on it. Sometimes teacher gives too much engaged time, like they'll give them or allocate too much time for students to do something, and then kids goof off and they don't do it. And then sometimes they do it too small, where they don't give them 5 minutes and they have 40 questions to do. And with time as well, which we're going to look at in just a second, we have a lot of wasted time in school too. So here's the model. Let me go back and look and see what page it's on. It is on page 217 when we look at Ch9's model, and it's figure 9.1. And he talks about that these are like an interlocking, effective instruction is all these components: quality of instruction, time, appropriate levels of instruction, incentive, are all that locking, they lock together to make what is an effective instruction. So if you look at quality of instruction, it's a high quality curriculum. Our curriculum is based on the next generation Sunshine State standards, or as you guys read about and should have done a blog about last chapter, about the Common Core. The Common Core is the standards that are used throughout most of the states in the country, so that if you traveled from state to state, you would be able to pick up the curriculum wherever you left out. The information that's organized, that it has a logical, sequential organization. If you notice how I do the PowerPoints here, they go along the chapter. I'm not switching from the back of the chapter to the front of the chapter, the middle of the chapter. So it's presented in this orderly fashion so that you can follow along. You have to assess and evaluate in order to adapt your instruction to the needs of your students. So when we're talking about quality of instruction, if everyone in your class already has a piece of this or already knows something, you can skip that. You might maybe do a quick review on it, or have the kids talk about it with a quick review, and then you move on, so that you're not boring down and bogging down the kids with something they already know. And that will give you a little bit more time to stretch out that engaged time, or that instructional time, where you'll be able to teach that concept what they're struggling with a little bit. So you have to know the curriculum well enough, and I'm talking about the scope and sequence of the entire curriculum, not just go day to day or week to week. You want to look at, what do I have to teach this entire year? Because sometimes you might be able to overlap maybe a history lesson with a reading lesson, or a science lesson or a math lesson into social studies. And then you can make connections for kids. But you have to be able to do that. You have to know your curriculum well enough that you're able to make those connections with the kids. And that's what is the difference between a really highly effective teacher and just an effective teacher. Because a highly effective teacher understands the curriculum well enough that they can just pull it off the top of their head and know how everything fits together. Appropriate levels of instruction. Students have different levels, prior skills, prior knowledge, different motivations, even different learning rates. Even really smart kids might learn at a slower rate than some of the other kids. But teachers need to utilize assessment and evaluation to figure out what those instructional levels are, so that you know which kids you're going to pull up and which kids, that you're going to give a little extra incentive to. I always like to draw, and I'm going to try and draw again on the board, a pyramid. Because your curriculum, you should plan your curriculum for all students. And up at the top of the pyramid is about 10% of your class. And that 10% is going to be the kids that pretty much, even if you didn't teach them, are going to know most of the stuff that you're talking about. If you have a standard, they're going to pretty much have mastered the basics of that standard. So those kids, you're going to be able to push them a little bit farther. You might give them a supplemental assignment that goes along with it, something that would enrich everybody in the class, and then they could present that material. About 80% of your kids are going to be, you're going to be teaching. Most teachers teach to this 80% because it's the majority of the kids in the class, and it's just the basics. But if you do that, then that 10% are getting kind of lost in the sense that they already know this, so they're bored. And when they're bored, a lot of times they'll act out. And if you have good 10% kids and they don't act out, they're just going to sit there and be bored. If you have somewhat mischievous 10% that are really bright, they're going to pull the other kids off task, and they're just going to make your life miserable. So if you teach just to the 80%, you're going to lose that 10%. And then you got the 10% on the bottom, and those are your kids that are not going to totally get it. So you're going to have to ask yourself, what is the baseline of what I have to teach? What is the bottom, the least amount? Now, some teachers will actually teach to this 10%. They teach just to the bottom level, the bottom rung. And they say, well, don't worry, if I teach to this, then everybody's going to get it. Well, yeah, but then the 80 and the 10 are also going to be bored. So you want to hit up here, closer to the top, closer to that 10%. At the top of the pyramid, because what you're going to do is, if you plan for everybody, then some of these 80% are going to go up here to with the 10% of the kids, the really high level kids, and then those 10% low level kids are going to be pushed to go up into the middle. So if you teach to the upper end of that 80%, closer to where the high level kids are, then you've got this scaffolding that's going to bring everybody up. And so when we talk about that, that's that idea of differentiating your instruction so that you meet the needs of all the kids in your classroom. So Carroll's Quate model is an incentive that students should be motivated to learn. So Carroll's Quate model of school learning talks also about incentives. Students should be motivated to learn. To make learning relevant to students, you have to make it relevant to their lives. It has to seem to be something that they're interested in or that they can see usefulness out of. Examples of incentives are praise, feedback, grades, certificates, star, prizes, recognition that what they're doing is worthwhile. Time, which are talked about already a little bit. Teacher plans for instruction. They plan for how long it's going to take something, and they know approximately how long something should take. And then there's the actual time spent teaching. There's actually been some data that shows about this, that a lot of the school day is wasted on announcements or going to and from different areas or transition time. So the amount of time on instruction depends on the teacher's effective use of classroom management techniques. Being able to transition from reading to math in a short period of time, or how long it takes you to deliver a lesson. announcements, all that kind of stuff. Pacing is another one too. Sometimes teachers teach too fast, but typically in the beginning teachers teach too slow and they don't get through all of their lessons. Another aspect that we have to look at is how do we group kids? Your book talks about several ones. It talks about between class ability grouping, untracking, within class ability grouping, regrouping for reading and mathematics, and then they also talk about retention. Students differ in their knowledge, skills, motivation, and predispositions towards what is to be taught, and then accommodating instruction to student differences is one of the most fundamental problems in education. And so when we talk about these differences, we talk about what is effective and what's not. And sometimes what we're doing in schools is not necessarily best practices in research. Tracking, probably the least effective, and it should be diminished in use, however we still do it. Students are assigned to a track. Many countries actually do this. They'll track kids like in third grade, whether you're going to go to a vocational track or a college-bound track or a professional track. And you'll take a specific sequence of classes. Those of you that were like in IB, that would be a tracking one. It takes a specific or a specified curriculum sequence for their coursework. It's very homogeneous in the performance level that you have all your high-level kids, and then it might be a low-level track that they're the kids that are like not college-bound and stuff like that. College prep, general, vocational tracks are typically the type of tracking. The research on this is actually not good. The kids who are in the high-level track seem to do okay, but the kids who are in the low-level track, they don't have any role models, and it is so they don't tend to follow they don't have any good role models, so their grades tend to suffer, and then a lot of times they'll drop out, or the expectations are low, and that we've actually found that a lot of teachers, when they teach that group of kids, they don't expect much from them, so they the low track classes seem to be harmful because there's just nothing there. And then the instruction in untracked or mixed ability classes more closely resembles the teaching of the high. So if we untrack kids, they tend to do better because they're more heterogeneous, so that they're with the high level kids and they have role models, and then things tend to do better. Kids tend to do better. So the bottom line is tracking or between class ability grouping is that does not show to be positive. It does not show positive results. So when we talk about between class ability groupings, it's assign students to classes according to their measured abilities. So you might be like in an advanced algebra class or a remedial algebra class. So variations of technique tend to, it depends on which one you are. Now, if you're in the high ability class, you tend to do better because kids that are, you've got these good role models and all that kind of stuff. We do this a lot in schools, but the research on it is that not actually favorable. Students could be in more advanced math classes than an average science class, but the research, like I said, even though we do it all the time, research does not support its use. The negatives for between class ability groupings is discussions for inclusion based on ability, a general ability, not on a particular subject, that you lack role models. There tends to be low expectations for teachers. The curriculum is narrowed to focus on more facts and fewer concepts in the lower groups. They just kind of give them the basics instead of pushing them towards the higher end. Little effort is made to differentiate instruction because they just figure everybody's on the same page. This is all the low kids, so I'm just going to gear it towards the low. And little effort is made to utilize different teaching strategies. It's more of the same original instruction. It's kind of like skill and drill because we just figure that they need to get the basics. It also has stigmatizing effects on students. Like I'm in the dum-dum class. That's what my students used to always say. Oh, I'm in the dum-dum class. And then student populations tend to consist of kids from the low socioeconomic group. So that it just keeps going. It becomes a cycle that happens over and over again. So we have to go into something called untracking. And your book talks about untracking, and there has been some success with untracking, and it's regrouping for reading and mathematics. So students leave mixability classrooms, so most of the day they're in mixability groups for instruction in homogeneous settings for a short amount of time, and then they return to their original classrooms, because it is hard to differentiate. I used to have a class where at one time I had a kid that read on a pre-primer level, and then I had a kid in the same class who read on a 7th grade level. Well, when you're doing pre-reading to all the way to 7th grade, it's kind of hard to differentiate. But now that a lot of schools are using something called walk to intervention, and what they do is for like 20 minutes to a half hour a day, the kids actually go to a different class with a different teacher, and they learn a specific skill that they're lacking. But the nice part of that is that it's a fluid, so that you're not always with the same group of kids. It really depends on what skill that you're lacking. The Joplin Plan, students from mixed ability classrooms lead to be regrouped across grade levels. So if you're a 1st grader and you read on a 3rd grade level, you might be with 3rd graders at that time. And then the same thing with if you're a 3rd grader and maybe in math you're struggling a little bit and you're working more on a 2nd grade level, then you're going to be in that age group. So it takes a little bit away from the stigmatism, because everybody's moving at the same time, and you don't really know what's going on in all those other classes. Other techniques for untracking is non-graded or cross-age grouping. A lot of elementary schools do this, where students work across grade lines, but it might be flexible grouping on specific instructions based on need, much like the walked intervention is. But walked intervention usually typically stays within one grade level, where non-graded and cross-age grouping goes across grade levels. Within class ability grouping is probably the most used. It's utilized in mathematics and reading instruction. Like I said, I had a reading group with a low level, a pre-primer all the way to a 7th grade. Students within classes are provided instruction in homogeneous groups based on their need. So I will have like one reading group, which might be my lower reading group, and then I have a high reading group, and I might be doing something different with my high reading group. Guided reading, when you do guided reading and you're pulling reading groups, is an example of this. Another thing that your book talks about is retention, and the research on retention. We're in Florida here. You're required to, if you don't pass the reading test in 3rd grade, you're required to be retained. But there's no good research that we've had. There isn't any supportive research on retention. However, we keep doing it, even though that we don't have any research on it. And one of the reasons they say is because if children don't know how to read by 3rd grade, they're at a higher risk of dropping out of failing. But the other research on retention shows that kids who are retained drop out at a much faster rate than kids that are not retained. And so a lot of proponents say that we're giving them the gift of time, that we're letting them catch up. But the earlier you tend to retain, like let's say a kid's developmentally not ready really in kindergarten to move on, if they repeat kindergarten, then they're likely to do better than if it happens in 3rd grade.